So as we talked about for a minute, most of our listeners today are HR people leaders. And at Lattice, we've been trying to help companies navigate through an extraordinarily tumultuous year. The way I see it, at least two major things have happened, sort of at least two. The first was that, we had this global pandemic and we are still reeling in many ways. And sort of like you just said, a lot is good and a lot has been impressive, but there's been a lot that's difficult for lots of people. And all of our plans are turned upside down, and it's difficult for families at home to navigate if you've got kids who are school age and all sorts of craziness. So there's that. And then the second is that racial tensions in the US boiled over, starting with the killing of George Floyd, but it continues. And there are sort of too many to mention. There's Breonna Taylor, there's just recently Jacob Blake. And so we're sort of watching these gross injustices happen, and we're all realizing that these are not isolated incidents. They are manifestations of deep systemic racism in our country. And I guess my question for you to start is, what's the connection between these two things? They seem to have relationship with one another, but how do you think about that in your mind? How do you organize when you're reflecting on this year? How are those connected?
Well, I think one of the first things we have to acknowledge is that coronavirus has left society with a really short fuse. And this can be applied across the board, throughout society, from country to country. We're in a world that we're not comfortable with. We're in a world that we're not familiar with. And with that comes a definite level of angst. We're living in a space where people are afraid because they don't know what tomorrow will bring. And with that fear comes a lot of anger. And so that means that everybody's running around with a short fuse. And when society's in a place like this, it's only inevitable that civil unrest follows. The question is, what will that unrest be about? In some countries around the world, it's only been about the pandemic and the response that different governments have taken to it. But in the US, there was an underlying issue that has existed for a long time, and it's the relationship that communities have had with their police. Where police for a very long time have existed in a world where they aren't accountable to anybody outside of the police. And they've been, unfortunately, they haven't had to answer to anybody. And so even many police will tell you this. It doesn't help when there are so many police who aren't negatively affected by their negative actions, but the communities that they police are negatively affected, and the police departments themselves are negatively affected. And so I think one has definitely affected the other. I don't think we would have seen the protests the way we did were it not for the pandemic and people being locked down and quarantined. And I don't think that the response would have been the same if life were the same. It's so easy to be distracted by everything that's going on in life. We have wonderful distractions, from movies to sports, to Broadway shows and events, going out for dinner. There's so many reasons to not pay attention to everything that's happening in the world, which is actually good for human beings. But in this moment in time, I think what's been really good is we have been forced to focus on everything that's going on. And I think that's really changed how people have viewed what is happening in society around them.
I love that framework of the pandemic shortening this fuse and then these issues that were there bubbled up. And it makes me wonder, do you see us as becoming more fragile as a country or more resilient through all of this?
Well, I think it all depends on how the country reacts to it. I think in these moments more than ever, this is when you realize what a leader is meant to do. A leader, especially the president of the United States, is meant to be somebody who brings both sides together in a moment to say, hey, we are responding to this external threat. We need to fight it. And, if you look at somebody like, let's say, George Bush, although I don't agree with many of his policies and I don't agree with many of the ways he ran his administration and what they did around the world, one thing he understood around 9/11 was the we-ness of it all. It happened to all Americans. He didn't think of it as a New York thing. He didn't think of it as a DC thing. He thought of it as an all Americans thing. And he rallied America around a single idea. Now, the thing that's happening in America today is you have a leader who unfortunately doesn't seem to quite grasp that and has left people flailing, blaming each other. Because that's inevitably what's going to happen, is if we don't have a shared goal, we're then going to create each other as common enemies. And I think that's been the struggle that we're looking at today is living in a world where people don't know who to blame because nobody has answers, because it's a novel virus that nobody really knows how to fix.
In your book, you talked about growing up in South Africa. It was beautifully written, and you described apartheid and how sinister systemic racism really is in a way that I think was eye-opening for many of us in this country reading it. You've also now lived in the US for a decade, and you've seen, a certain flavor of racism that exists here. And somehow you always find ways to use humor through incredibly tricky issues. Not always, sometimes you say this isn't a moment for it, but oftentimes in a time when I think so many of us can't find strength, you seem to do that through a type of lightness and a humor that doesn't discredit and doesn't make small of the issue, but does allow you to bring your humanity. And I think through this year, while it's been so difficult on so many fronts, many of us kind of clam up. Certainly in a workplace setting, we kind of clench and we become more robotic, and we can't find an authentic voice because we don't know what to say. We don't know what mood or energy to channel. And so I guess my question is, what's the mindset that allows you to do that? How do we use humor, maybe even in a professional setting, to work through difficult moments? Or maybe how do we know when it's maybe just not the right time for it? But how can we channel more of that?
Well, I think before humor, the thing we need to focus on is humanity. I think the thing we could spend a lot more time on as people is just taking a moment to connect to the human in everybody else. And so during the toughest times, I find that's what helps me, is connecting with human beings. Upon connecting with human beings, I come to find that humor then becomes the natural language that we use to process the things that are happening to us in the world. And that's something that I think human beings do naturally. I always tell people in the office place, everyone goes like, "Oh, can we bring more jokes into the workplace? And what can we do? And how do we do this?" And I always tell people, I go like, "Well, remember, jokes are all about context. So I always tell people to be afraid, because sometimes people will force jokes into the workplace. And I'm like, well, if you're not careful, you can tell the wrong joke to the wrong person and they can take it the wrong way. Whereas humor is something that is shared between people who have an understanding of where the other person comes from. Without context, there is no humor. You say things to your friends that you would never say to anybody else, and that's great. You say things to your family that you would never say to anybody else, and that's because you all know each other. You know the truth. You know where you all come from. You know what the story behind it all is. And so I think that's really important for people to acknowledge and understand, is that humor cannot exist without humanity. It cannot exist without us connecting as human beings and then understanding what makes the other person laugh or why something can be funny. And so for me, I'm really lucky that, it's been many years connecting with my audience. I've been hosting The Daily Show for 5 years. As a stand-up, I've been doing that now for, I think, going on 14 years, maybe 15. And so in that realm, it's been wonderful to grow with an audience who I sometimes see in person, and then sometimes I don't. I connect with them online, and they follow what I'm doing. And so we built a sort of relationship. And so if I'm ever talking to you at home, I work off the idea that you have an idea of who I am as a human being. You know that I use humor. You know that I don't necessarily find everything funny, but humor is a tool that I use to pierce a moment of pressure. And I think that's very important for us to remember to do as human beings. But context is very important, because without that, you might hurt somebody who you were hoping to make laugh.
It's a bit analogous to something in our world of HR where, what Lattice does is help people give each other better feedback. And I think feedback is a really powerful tool if there's trust underlying it. But it's a very clumsy tool if you just meet somebody for the first time and you start, laying into them.
Oh, definitely.
So there's a bit of that where, to use humor, they have to know where you're coming from and trust you somehow.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost exactly the same thing. You can give somebody feedback that is really fantastic and insightful, but if you give it to them the wrong way because you don't have a context for who they are, they don't have a context for you are, you've basically gone and offended someone. You've stepped in and you've said, "Hey, Jack, I think that you need to work on this or that or this or that." And then what Jack hears is, "Jack, you suck." That's what Jack's hearing. But if you're friends and you say this to Jack, Jack might be like, "Oh, wow, thanks for taking the time, Trevor. Thanks for helping me improve. Thanks for connecting with me. Thanks for even noticing me." And I think that's what we all have to be wary of, is what is our connection with the other person when giving them information.
That's great advice. So for most of us, myself included, but most of us at this who are listening into this event, the sort of main vehicle through which we can enact change in the world is through a workplace. And personally, I think that's a great vehicle for change. I think there's a lot of power in that. We spend a lot of our hours in the day there. It's important to people's lives. So to me, I sort of think of it up there with systems like healthcare and education. And I would love to hear from you what you see as the role that companies can play. If I'm a company leader, if I'm leading an HR or people team, or if I'm just part of a company, what are the ways that you see companies able to address the difficulties of this year? What message might you have for how we can be part of the solution in making a better country?
Well, I mean, the first one is one that isn't easy, but I would encourage companies, especially through this period, to take the time and take the effort to look after their employees the way they've expected their employees to look after their companies for this long. Companies have always asked people who work for them to do more, to do better, to help grow the company, to help sustain the company, to keep the company profitable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But during a tough time like this, I think this is where companies should be able to take a few knocks on the chin and say, you know what, as a company, it's going to be hard, but our people who make up the company, we're going to work our utmost to keep them surviving. And I know it's not easy. Some companies don't even exist because of coronavirus, so I don't take it lightly at all. And some companies are doing the best they can. With regards to the situation in the country, it's a lot more difficult. But I think, again, countries have a wonderful opportunity. I mean, companies have a wonderful opportunity to try and address some of the things that they see out in the world by giving a platform to people within their companies to try and express their thoughts and feelings in a safe space. And so what that means is just providing an environment where marginalized groups within a company can step up and say, hey, this is what I've noticed and I think we can improve on in the company, whether it's anonymously or whether it's through a forum that people have set up where they know, hey, trigger warnings, nobody's trying to fight here, but this is what we can do to try and improve this workplace. I think that's something that's really crucial in growing companies that are not just sustainable, but also mindful of the issues that their staff faces coming into the company. Because a company doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so, the same way women had to stand together and say, hey guys, there's a lot of crap that goes on in companies that men are doing to women that isn't acceptable. And then companies and men had to listen. I think that's important. Because one of two things was happening. Either a lot of guys were getting away with things that they shouldn't have been, or a lot of people were unaware. A lot of guys were unaware of the things that might have been microaggressions or small moments that they really took for granted because they were operating from a dominant position. And so I think that helps. It's just giving people a forum to say, this is what we can improve on. Have you guys noticed that every time this happens, these people are excluded? Have you ever noticed that this time these conversations every time this happens, those people are excluded? And I think in giving people a platform to speak, I think we can find a place where we start to acknowledge, and maybe not fix overnight, but just acknowledge some of the shortcomings that companies have inherited from societies. And then maybe upon acknowledging them and understanding them, they can begin to implement ideas and policies that will change the company from the inside. And if enough companies do it, who knows? Maybe they might start to affect what's happening on the outside.
I love that your first thought that you started with was about how employees give so much to companies and how it needs to be two ways. It's really amazing to me, at least in the time that I've been working, that the relationship between companies and employees seems to be getting more deeply intertwined over time. And I don't know if it's because we're always on our phones or if it's because we're missing some other community structures, but it does seem to me that as time goes on, the work-life separation seems to be dissipating, and it's just so tied into the fabric. And so when there are these moments, companies have to be there for their employees as people, not just employees.
Yeah, definitely. I think for a long time, companies have been saying things to their employees like, we're a family, thank you for being part of this family. Thank you for, and it's like, well, if that's the case, then how would you treat your family through the toughest times? And personally, I've never been a fan of the idea of family. I understand why people say it, but I've been a big fan of saying to people, let's be professional. Let's respect each other. Let's work together. What I don't want to do is burden anybody in my company with the idea that they have to go above and beyond because they think of me as family. You're not my family, and I'm not your family. I want us to work hard and work efficiently so that you have time to go to your family and so that you can enjoy your family. And so that's what I'm always trying to promote within my company is a space where we respect each other. We spend a lot of time together. So in that way, we become friends. We become more than acquaintances. We become people who share our lives together. But I also don't want people to ever feel like they're indebted to me on a personal level because they're doing something which they're being remunerated for. And so I think that relationship also needs to be maintained in a healthy manner.
I agree. I've heard some people describe that as we're not trying to be a family. It's closer to a sports team or something like that, where it's tight knit, high performance. We expect a lot of each other, but not my blood. Yeah. So that's like how to treat people inside the company. I think a huge thing that's certainly coming up in our corner of the world is thinking a lot more about equity in hiring, pay, promotions, all of that sort of focus, which is really important and I think is still quite out of date in many ways. You mentioned at one point, which I loved, the need for more opportunity, like needing a fishing rod before you can even teach a man to fish. And I really like that metaphor because so often it's, so many of the basics have to get there before we can expect equality. I think the idea of equity is not clear in so many people's minds. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about this concept? What are the ways that you think about, driving a more equal world and to have starting places that feel more fair? What's your mental model for this stuff?
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, it's tough because we have to admit first that we've been conditioned by the world that we live in. And so, whether you like it or not, most people are operating from the place where they go, a straight white man is going to be the most efficient at doing most jobs. So when you say to most people, doctor, lawyer, accountant, pilot, the first thing they're thinking is straight white man. Whether they think it or not, like consciously, they're not even trying to be bad. This is not a bad thing. It's how we've been conditioned as human beings. And so what's really difficult is changing the concepts and ideas that we have for what people should look like in a certain position, understanding that anybody can be in a certain position. And oftentimes all it takes is that one change. It's that one moment where somebody gets an opportunity. I've had conversations with some of the biggest CEOs in the world, and one thing they've all said to me, almost anonymously, when I ask, how did you get here, is they say, someone took a chance on me. I didn't have the right qualifications. I had never done this before. Nobody knew what I was supposed to do or not do, but somebody took a chance on me. And that is one of the most powerful things you realize is if people can see the potential in others, they can give them the opportunity to rise and meet that potential. And oftentimes, we see potential in people that look like those who have previously occupied the positions of power. And that's not, again, it's not malicious, but it's how we've been programmed.
It's so true. And then people who maybe don't look like us, we're not evaluating them on potential, it's on your experience.
Exactly. And so, just think of it, even if you take it out of the workplace. If you're a kid who grows up seeing dads always do a certain thing, dads hang up bookshelves, or dads are the ones who hammer things, dads are the one, in your mind, when you're now picking somebody who's going to come and hammer nails into your wall, you go like, what does it look like? It's a man looks like a dad, that's what I need. And so if you have two people who have applied for a job to come and, nail bookshelves into your walls, it's a woman and a man, subconsciously, sometimes you don't even realize, you're like, well, they're equal, but I mean, I think he'd be better. Why do you think he'd be better? Because you've been conditioned to thinking he'd be better. And it's hard to know when this is happening to us. I think we all have it, whether we like it or not. And so what's really difficult, and it's also an opportunity in HR, is for people to start digging into their subconscious biases and going, why do we think these people are better? Why do we think this person's efficient? Why do we give these people certain opportunities? And once we do that, we can start to undo it and realize that we can create a more equitable workplace where we give people opportunities, also not based on the previous disadvantages they had, the previous salaries they had, the previous blocks that they had, but the current opportunities that we think they have. And I think that's something that's really important to work on. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. But I do think the upside, if we get it right, is that we can start to build a more equitable society because it trickles down. That's the one time when trickling down actually does happen, is you have a company that employs people that are diverse. Those people got into their communities, and because you've got so many diverse employees, so many diverse parts of communities are affected positively, and that leaves us in a better place.
That's right. Yeah, it's a virtuous cycle. And when you have more examples of a doctor who looked all sorts of different potential ways, that just makes it so much easier for people to understand for them. I can pattern match myself to that when I'm growing up, and I can take those courses. I read a stat recently that 3% of executives and senior leaders in big U.S. companies are African American out of like 13+% in the U.S. population. And so when the pump isn't properly primed, we do, like you said, have to fight all of these human instincts of matching, myself when I'm growing up as a kid to what do I see and what are the examples.
Right, definitely.
So you mentioned in your book the importance of language, that it's a great equalizer, that words matter. I totally agree with this. Even subtle little things like whether somebody says I and my team and I did this versus we accomplished this and our team did this. I think those little things make a huge difference. And you talked about this really eloquently in your book. Can you describe in sort of your own words why language is so important to you, even for people who have never sort of heard you talk about it? What is that importance rooted in?
Well, I think one of the most important things for people to understand is language is one of the biggest things that can divide us or bring us together. And this doesn't just apply to different languages from different places. It applies to language in how we communicate with each other. And that means, like, even within English, there are many different languages that we might speak. For instance, when we're in the corporate world, we use a different language to communicate with each other. There are different words that may be jargon. There may be different, conversations that we would have that we wouldn't have at home or in the streets, etc. But that's the language that we use. And I think that's something that we should never take for granted, is how powerful language can be. Because what you can do with language is you can include people or you can exclude people. And so, when you're working in a team where you all know the same things and you know the vocabulary of what you need, you're throwing it around, you feel like you're part of something. That's the power of language. When language is being used that excludes you, you feel like you can't connect at all. And that's, again, the power of language. And so for me, I think when communicating, it's really difficult because we all come from different walks of life. We all use language differently. We've all been in different worlds existing. So we have to be cognizant of the language that we use in communicating with each other. And so to your point, it's the difference of a manager or a CEO or somebody saying, oh, at the company, I've done this year and I've done this, as opposed to going we, because it is a we. Yes, you're the captain steering the ship, but that ship cannot operate sans everybody else coming together. And so I think it's so important for us to acknowledge those moments in language where we have an opportunity to create a more inclusive environment where people feel like they're participating as opposed to just working and then having their work product taken from them and having somebody else take the credits.
Yeah, and language is one of those amazing things because it's literally the only way that ideas are going from my brain to your brain to our audience, and yet we don't think about it. We don't even think about it. It's like, a fish swimming in water. It's amazing how important it is.
Yeah, it's subconscious. And that's the thing. It's completely subconscious. And so that's another thing I think people might not realize is when you live in a country like America, it's very similar to South Africa in that it is a melting pot. But the thing people have to understand is there's a gift and curse of coming from a melting pot or living in a melting pot, and that is that we have so many different languages that we speak every single day. If you live in Germany, for the most part, everyone is speaking the same language. If you live in Japan, everyone's speaking the same language. And that doesn't just mean the words, it means the culture. And when you come from a country where so many people are speaking different languages, you have to be wary of the fact that sometimes, whether intentionally or not, a thing you say might be taken the wrong way by somebody else. And what's interesting is we do this willingly when we're working with people that are in actual different countries. I remember when companies first discovered, okay, when you go to Japan, you don't shake hands, you bow. You say certain things in a certain way. That's how we conduct business in Japan. And because people wanted to conduct business in Japan, they learned. People are starting to learn about how to speak to people in China. They go like, what are their cultural preferences and how do we communicate? Same thing in the Middle East. And so I go, if we are willing and able to do those things to create and foster business with international clients, why don't we do that within our own environments? Why don't we learn that within our environments, this makes it easier to communicate with each other. When I'm talking to somebody from a different background, I've got to be wary of this. When someone's speaking to me, I've got to understand that they mean that. And I think those are some of the small things we can do to use language to create a more synergistic world where everyone is moving in the same direction and not being blocked by the idea that they're not moving in the same direction.
Yeah. And this is probably something people are going to need to think about a lot more, because as we build more diverse workplaces, there's going to be a lot more languages. Even if we're all speaking English, there's going to be more languages.
Yes.
And then whose responsibility is that? I think so often now, people of color or people who are less represented in the workplace have to try to sort of switch to the language that's being used and burden,
code switching. Yep.
What code switching? One more burden. And so, like, how do we navigate that? Like, if companies we're trying to welcome, more diversity into our companies, but we're not, taking that into consideration.
Right.
What do we do?
Well, I think it's a two-way street. So here's the thing, as you said correctly, so many people, not just black people, but so many people who come from minority communities are really good at code switching. They know how to go from their world where they're throwing words around and sounding as loose and as free as they want to getting into a corporate structure where everybody speaks like this. They know how to do that. What is great is if we work in a world where we acknowledge that is happening. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because as humans, we've always found ways to code switch. It's wired into our survival. It's the same way babies mimic a parent, because they inherently, I think that's how humans are designed. We're designed to fit into groups. But it would be nice if companies existed in a world where they didn't think that a black person speaking naturally means that they're less professional. And I'm not talking about, you see, people might sometimes jump to like the ideas of like profanity and they're like, oh, so what? No. That's another problem. Sometimes people think black people speak hip hop. There's two very different things. And that's also cultural understanding. It's just like, just because somebody speaks a different way to you doesn't mean they're any less professional than you in some cases. And so I think that's important for people to learn, is that like, once you open yourself to that idea, you come to understand that everyone can be as professional and as productive as you are, even though they may be using language slightly differently. And so, you see that not just with black people. Somebody who comes from the South, they have to get over the idea that people think that oftentimes they are mentally inferior because they've got that drawl. And so if somebody comes in with that Southern drawl and they gonna talk to you like this, a lot of people are like, oh Lord, this person is gonna get us stuck behind. You may find that person is far ahead of where you are in the business world. And so I think that's just the thing, is understanding that inherently each person is there for a reason, each person is professional, but they also have the part of human that still connects them to who they are within the workplace.
And it probably goes back to what we were saying earlier of the importance of more examples, more exposure, more connection with more people that aren't
definitely
normal.
Yeah.
What's the positive side? How do we use language to unite us, whether that's inside a company or as a society more broadly? What are some ways that we can use language as like a unifying force?
Well, I think we analyze our words. We've started doing that. I'll give you a personal example. I took for granted how, when growing up as a kid, the word man at the end of certain jobs just made me think that job was for a man. And that's an implicit use of language that you don't really think about. Fireman, chairman, you go policeman, like those types of things. It's not malicious. It really isn't. It's an idea of how the world was. And that's how people then, frame the idea in their head for the time, for time to be. And I think that's something that we can be just cognizant of. We like small things where someone goes, all right, we're looking for someone to man this position. I know it's small and it's really silly, but it's like person has proved as effective a word. And I know that some people who are silly, will be like, but do we say we're going to change all our language for everything? It's like, yeah, but we've always done that. Society has always changed language. And so if we're not afraid to constantly evolve, then we will get to a place where we evolve. And we're going to look back and be like, man, I can't believe how much we were attached to these silly words because now we communicate more effectively. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have, is understanding that language has always evolved. Shakespeare, one of the greatest playwrights of our time, invented words. At some point he was just like, yeah, I'm just going to invent another word because these words are not working for me. And now we act like those words always existed. And so if somebody like Shakespeare could invent words, well, maybe we can change some of the words we use to try and create a more inclusive space for people.
And willingness to change is, people think it's weak, but it's not. It's strong. It's not fragile. Like, that's resilience. And so I think I couldn't agree more that open-mindedness and adaptation, that is what it's all about.
Definitely, yeah.
So I want to end on a positive note. One of my favorite things I've seen recently was President Obama giving a speech. And one of the things he said, which put words to an idea that I sort of had but didn't know how to describe, was that he was really heartened by the sort of enormous and quite diverse outpouring and support for Black Lives Matter. Sort of unlike any other civil unrest that he had seen in his lifetime. And he kind of drew us back through history. And you also have seen history, and you've seen many countries. So did you feel that same thing that he was speaking to?
Definitely. I hate why it happened, but I loved seeing in the streets white kids fighting for Black Lives Matter as if those were their lives. Because inherently they understand that equality and justice are things that affect everybody, not just the person who is being oppressed. And I think that's something that can put us in a fast lane. It can put us in the fast lane to progress in society, is if we truly understand that the lowest common denominator is always going to determine how far and how fast we can move in society. We think to ourselves, oh, I'm giving charity to that person, or I'm doing this for them. It's like, no, everything that you do for the person who has the least benefits everybody, even those who have the most. And so here's a simple example. There are countries around the world where people work their damnedest as a government to give everybody housing, to give everybody education, to make sure that people who are unemployed get some sort of benefit, to make sure that mothers can work from home or afford to not work and not lose their opportunities in the workplace. And while many people will feel like that's a charity, what they've shown happens in these countries is that you then plant the seeds for amazing innovation to grow. Because many people have great ideas, not many people have the capital or the backup to work on those great ideas. So Mark Zuckerberg is a good example. The guy's created one of the most powerful media and social media and internet giants in history. People will go, oh, he's self-made. It's like, well, you can say that, but Mark Zuckerberg was also on a stipend from his parents. They gave him a few $100,000, and they were like, we'll keep giving you money. His parents were dentists or somewhere in the medical field, and they made sure that they kept him afloat so that he could build his dream. And that's something you take for granted in society. If we help everybody just stay afloat, we shouldn't think of it as a world where it's charity, where it's like, oh, we're helping them. It's like, no, we're helping us. Everybody benefits from that, because from that world where a mom doesn't have to choose between her career and her child comes a world where she raises a child with less stress, with less burden, with more passion, with more purpose and joy. And then that child grows up to become a more productive member of society, and we have this positive reinforcement that keeps spinning us forward and forward and forward and forward. And so I think that's what Obama was talking about with the kids, is it is heartening to see people fight for equality and freedom. It shouldn't only be the people who are being downtrodden who fight. Everyone should fight. The rich should fight for the poor. Men should fight for women. White people should fight for black people. And hopefully it gets to the point where there is no longer a fight, because we've worked together to achieve what we were looking for in the first place. And so I think that is heartening to see, is a new generation who sees themselves as more similar because they experience the similarities of a stagnant economy for themselves in terms of wages, or a world that makes it increasingly harder to live and buy your own house. And so for many of them, they see each other more similarly than maybe we did generations before.
Such a wonderful answer. I'm going to let you go and get back to the rest of your evening. Thank you so much. I got an incredible amount out of this conversation, and I'm sure our audience did too. And you were just a hugely inspiring voice for so many people. I hope you know that, and just thank you for everything that you do.
And thank you so much. Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you for taking the time to engage in these questions. It's not easy. It's not going to be solved overnight, but I really think it's important for us to have these chats and for us to get into the more uncomfortable discussions on how to move companies and society forward. And don't listen to what anyone says to you. That plant is fantastic right where it is. I think it looks natural. You don't let them judge you. Next time you're on a Zoom, you don't say it's not supposed to be. You say this was my space from the very beginning. This is natural. This is Jack's place.
This is my natural thing, man. Well, Trevor, thank you so much. Thank you. This was lovely.
Thank you.
And everybody in the audience, thanks again for spending the day with us. Have a great rest of your night.
Goodbye, everyone.
And